it would seem too that even in this system, both the murderer and the victim, I would say, seem to be in some very real sense both victims of God's, unchangeable decree.
So I think what you're doing is you're trying to frame up an idea that's a finite temporal analogy of an infinite, holy, all-powerful God.
To start out here, I just want to kind of give just explain real quick, and then I'll let you kind of introduce a bit about yourself, Dave, and basically how you came to be a Calvinist, and then maybe help people also understand what your particular views of Calvinism are, like what they look like, what form of it you would take. But the purpose of this video, I think we kind of agree that we're not, maybe we might, I don't know, I'll see how both of us feel about it. But for a title, we could maybe say, a friendly debate between a Calvinist and non-Calvinist. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're trying to avoid even calling this a debate. We're calling this a conversation between Dave, who I feel we've been talking for the past 2 or 3 weeks, through WhatsApp and so on. And I feel Dave is, although I haven't met him face to face, I consider Dave to be a friend, even though we have alternative perspectives on this. And so this conversation is not about trying to, do a mic drops on the other one or make the other one look dumb, but to genuinely, again, try to understand each other's positions, and then to just let other people hear perhaps 2 different perspectives being shared so that you can weigh them and see which one do you personally think is more valid. And so this is going to be a friendly conversation. That doesn't mean that we won't disagree with each other. That doesn't mean that there won't be passion behind the things that we say. But just to be clear, I think it's more important to pursue genuine love and respect than it is to pursue trying to prove that you have the right, theology. So
yeah, we don't write an exam when we enter heaven, right? We don't have to write a test when we enter heaven and say, did you get this point and this point and this point right? That's just not the way it works. So
that's a great point. Yeah, I think God's main concern isn't going to be whether you had every single point of doctrine, completely accurate. You see Jesus very little talking about, to the disciples that, concern about whether all of their doctrinal positions were in a row. That's not to say that it's not important.
Exactly.
But what he was concerned about, whether it was the Pharisees or his followers, was whether the condition of their heart was one that was expressing love for other people. And that, at the end of the day, that is, like Paul says, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And I believe that is the case for these conversations. So, Dave, let's just kind of get into this discussion here, and we can start with you just briefly, again, introducing yourself, a bit about who you are, and then tell us kind of how you came to believe in Calvinism.
Okay. So I grew up Reformed. I was born into Reformed family at church, and until my 20s, till I got married, was in a Reformed church. And really, I without getting into too much personal stuff, but I kind of had a lukewarm faith. So I wasn't particularly strong in my faith. I wasn't always seeing things properly. Probably a little bit of self-righteousness, or probably a little bit of motivation to just make my own life the way I wanted, I suppose. A lot of people have that, right? I run my own business. And I just didn't have a strong faith. I always went to church. My wife, wonderful believer. God bless me with her. That's a big part of why I am where I am too. But I can honestly say that growing up, the Reformed church I was in, I can't really remember them talking about Calvinism the way I often hear it discussed online, in terms of, these are the things you believe, as far as determinism. I don't remember any of that. And I did take catechism growing up, and we did learn the doctrines of grace, but it was not the focus. It was not the emphasis. The emphasis is Christ's love for us, what he did for us, and how we need to put our trust and our faith in him. So, just a nutshell idea of how I grew up. We left the Reformed Church. We changed churches because my wife started going to a Bible study to a church that was not Reformed. And I believe this is God working in my life to help me to see things more clearly. So this church, the pastor was Reformed in his doctrine, but it was not a Reformed church. And I can say that the people I met there were all wonderful, wonderful people. And we're still at that same church. And that really is what led me into sort of understanding two sides of this, because he would have sermons where he would explain both sides of a lot of different issues. And on this issue, as far as the election and predestination, what does it mean? What does the Bible teach? So yes, in his soteriology, he did believe the doctrines of grace. Our church still teaches that, but it's not like it's not a real out front type of a thing. It's just part of how God works in his church, in the world. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit here. So anyway, the pastor who was there, he ended up dying in 2000, I believe it was 2018. It's about 5 years ago. And that event kind of really affected me. Like, it really did. And then we also had, in my extended family, we had a 15-year-old girl who died in a car accident, and her niece, who was 3 months old, also died in the same accident. And I don't know why, but that just really made me start to think about life and who God is and how we deal with things and how we deal with grief. And I just totally changed. I every day in the Word, every day praying and trying to figure these things out. And this is where I stumbled across your channel. I've watched all kinds of different views on this. And listening to you try to get into the Word, try to explain what is it saying, I thought was really good. That's why I kind of reached out to you. So in my personal life, like, everybody's got struggles, but I think the Calvinist view of soteriology, and not just that, I mean, it's more of a overall view of doctrine in terms of how God's working in the world, not just soteriology. I think that gives people the assurance that he's in control. And I think that's one of the keys that I find is one of the most important things to understand, is that once you realize God is in control, he's not the author, but he does know exactly how things are playing out. I think that just gives people the assurance to trust him more. And yeah, we're going to probably get into a little bit of that too. So, but yeah, that, trying to give you a little testimony without getting too deep into it. But
yeah, could you explain a little bit, maybe just to paint a picture for people? Because what I find when I make videos on this is that one of the most common responses I'm getting with my Calvinism videos is Calvinists saying, hey, that's not Calvinism. That's not Calvinism. You're misrepresenting Calvinism. You don't understand Calvinism. And I'm convinced that that's not true. I don't think I'm misrepresenting Calvinism. I think I'm misrepresenting a lot of individual forms of Calvinism. And so what I think I hope people realize is that there's not just one version of Calvinism that people hold to. And I mostly try to look at the version of Calvinism that the prominent people like John Piper or even John Calvin would teach. And so could you give us an idea of, like, where do you land on this spectrum? You have John Piper. I think maybe somewhat tongue in cheek, but he'll say like he's a 7-point Calvinist. And so you do have 4-point, you have various forms of it. So where, I guess, would you land on this?
Well, it's funny. You sent me the text calling Piper a 7-point Calvinist, and I'd never heard that before. So I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. That was kind of funny. But I consider myself a 5-point Calvinist. But how are we defining those terms is critical, because I think when you begin to unpack it, first of all, I think the TULIP acronym is not helpful. I think that creates division right away, because they're trying to force an idea into a letter or a word that isn't really I don't think unpacking it very well. Off the top of my head, I'm not going to go through it all, but I think that's one of the misrepresentations of it, is that they right away jump to that acronym TULIP and try to unpack it. And okay, there's a lot to be said about that. There's obviously been, a lot of ink spilled over the years on these issues, but to unpack exactly where I stand, I believe, to also use a word that I don't think I've ever heard spoken in church, is determinism. How God determines everything to come to pass, I believe he does. I don't believe he's the author of sin. He is not happy about evil or sin. However, in his decree, he allows it. And I think there are very clear indications in God's word that show that. And I think that's one of the things that is a very difficult question. Nobody's pretending that's an easy thing to unpack, right? Everybody's affected by evil at some point in very many degrees. I mean, I sit here in my nice warm house with a cup of coffee talking about evil while I'm not really, exposed to it in the way a lot of people are. And that's also something we have to be aware of. I mean, there are persecutions going on in the world against Christians that we just, in our Western world, can't really get our head around, right? So, and I think in the Bible too, when they talk about the persecutions in the New Testament, those are real events that people had to say, okay, is God in control or not, right? When they're being persecuted. And I think that's a big part of Calvinism, is that they try to let people know that through these things, God is still in control. He is still the author of the events of your life, and you have to put your faith in him. So, yes, I'm a 5-point Calvinist. I do think the Bible is pretty clear on that. We can go text by text or whatever, but I think in general, I think the Bible is pretty clear on that. And I think it's important that people do rest in the fact that God is in control. Like, what's the alternative? If he's not in control, then I just heard something this morning, because I can't remember who it was I listened to, but they said, imagine in eternity, in heaven, God is going to abolish evil. He is not going to allow evil. But in this world, he does allow evil. So in some sense, he is in control of it, right? And in the future, in our eternal salvation, when we're with him, it won't even be a question. There will be nothing, no sin, no evil. And so he's obviously in control of it. So, yeah.
Right. Yes. And I think that's one thing that maybe there's often some misunderstandings about, because myself as a non-Calvinist, like I've for years listened to John Piper, his sermons on the sovereignty of God. And though there were nuances to what he said that I did not fully align with, the bulk of what he said, I could fully get on board with. Obviously, yeah. when he I think when he and even you and I use the word God, control, I think we might have different ideas about what that necessitates and what that looks like as it actually plays out in reality. But I fully get on board with the idea that God is 100% in control of all things, 100% sovereign meaning, as the word does, just rule, authority over all things. I think the distinction would come in, again, how we think that actually plays out in reality. What does that actually look like? What does God's control over everything actually look like? And so maybe I want to get to, I think the first text I think we talked about going over was Ephesians 1, because that's kind of where, again, our conversation began. But before that, I think maybe to kind of, again, just so we can understand where each other are coming from here. And I would even wonder, based off some of what you've just said, because I heard you using the word allow a couple times, which I think is a word that would not even be able to be used in John Piper's, for example, his vocabulary related to God's sovereignty. I think he would not ever use the word. I mean, he might use the word allow, but if you really get to the foundations of what he's saying, I think he would make sure to clarify that what he means is yes, God decisively causes ordains all things. There is really, the word allow isn't the best, most accurate way of thinking about it. So if it's all right with you, I wanted to just read, I'm going to read a couple quotes. So one quote is from Desiring God's webpage. I don't think this was John Piper himself, but it's somebody on the Desiring God page who, you know, is part of that ministry and who they're endorsing, obviously, by posting this guy's sermon and his writings, the things that were said. So I'm going to read this, and maybe this might help, because we can both answer, do we agree with what is said or not? So, quote, God brings about all things in accordance with his will. In other words, it isn't just that God manages to turn the evil aspects of our world to good for those who love him. It is rather that he himself brings about these evil aspects for his glory and his people's good. This includes, as incredible and as unacceptable as it may currently seem, God's having even brought about the Nazis' brutality at Birkenau, don't know if I'm saying that right, and Auschwitz, as well as the terrible killings of Dennis Rader and even the sexual abuse of a young child. So again, he's saying, end quote there, but he's saying it's not only that God, you know, takes these evil circumstances, these things that play out due to man's decisions, and takes those things and then turns them to good. It's actually that God is kind of at the beginning making sure that these evil things will unchangeably definitely come about. And so I guess, would you, having heard that, and maybe you'd want a little bit more time to look at it, but just offhand, what's your kind of initial response or reaction to that? Is that something you would agree with? Would you have some disagreement with anything there?
Mm-hmm. I think I wouldn't say it quite so strongly. I think I would stick with the word allow. But within the word allow, you do have to understand that by allowing it, he's still in control. So I think that's probably what Piper's trying to say. And I think also I've heard other people try to explain this. I'm really not going to drop names. I know we joked about that before. Yeah. And I don't want to attack Piper. I like Piper. But I think, I think I would have worded it maybe differently. But, I'm not a theologian. In the word allow, God is still in control of that event,
Yes, but sorry to cut you off, but wouldn't you agree though, because this is something I hear a lot too, a pushback from Calvinists when I will say these things. Wouldn't you see that just from an initial surface level viewpoint of the situation, to have a situation, for example, where somebody sees a murder taking place, a man murdering a helpless child or woman, he sees it and he doesn't do anything about it, that's a problem. I'll grant you, there's a problem there that, there's questions that raises. Why did he do that? But I think just initially there's an apparent difference between God allowing it and God, in a very real sense, being the one who's actually doing the murdering or causing the murdering, and so I think that's why I think there is, and what I'm going to read here in a minute, the next quote from John Calvin, he even will kind of push back on Calvinists using the word allow as if that actually makes sense within the systematic. So, okay. So sorry to cut you off. I think that's something that I think there's just even on a surface level, there's a moral difference there, even okay. Though, yes, I would admit there's problems that arise from both allowing or causing. But I think just objectively to directly cause the evil, to say he decisively causes it, is just even on a basic surface level is apparently, I think, objectively worse, if that makes sense.
Okay, so let me just address that quickly. So I think what you're doing is you're trying to frame up an idea that's a finite temporal analogy of an infinite, holy, all-powerful God. And I think that's a difficult thing to do because we do not see eternity. We only see an event in time with our eyes. And how that plays out in eternity is something we just cannot get our head around. So I think it's a really difficult thing as a human being to say, why did God allow this, or why did God make this happen, or why did this, there's some people that believe God is still learning. God doesn't even know when things happen. So, there's a whole openness theology that talks about that.
Right.
Everybody's trying to answer these questions, when really I don't think in our finite minds it's even really possible. So I think what Calvin and Piper and other people are trying to get their head around is these are difficult things. How do we understand it? How do we understand that, the idea of Hitler? Could God have had Hitler be killed in World War I? Of course he could. Would that have eliminated all of World War II? I guess so, unless somebody else rose to power. But, the evil that happens in the world, like, it is just mind-blowing how much evil is occurring in the world and has been since the fall. How do we even get our head around that, other than to say God is in control of this? He has to be. In our finite minds, it's just so hard to understand it. But
yeah,
we have to.
Yes.
Like, we have to have that faith and say, yes, God. Like, look at the shooting that happened in Nashville. I watched a lot of the stuff on that, and that is actually a Presbyterian church. That's a church that would believe what I believe. And I made a comment on a video. I don't think it was one of your videos, but I made a comment. I said, imagine not knowing that God's in control. How would those people react to their children being shot down? I think that the proper response is complete sorrow, absolute brokenness, but still trusting God and saying, God, I don't know why, but I still believe. I will have faith in you. I will still rely on you for the, you just have to do that as a Christian.
Yeah.
I don't know any other option, right? Can we make sense of it? No, there are no answers. Yeah. There's no answers in our lifetime. So
yes, and I agree that there is a massive amounts of comfort in knowing that whatever happens, even in horrific events like that, whatever terrible things come in my own personal life, that I 100% can get behind the statement that God is in full control of that. And things don't come to pass in my life that he is not, that but catch him off guard or that he's not aware of. Now, how I would push back, I think, to some of the things you just said, because talking about this specific example, for instance, of family who have, loved ones who were brutally murdered. And again, I would agree that, yes, there is so much comfort that they can find in this idea that God is in control. And I agree with you too, that we cannot fully understand it. But the prayer that a person might pray, I think here's maybe an example of what might be the different prayer between a Calvinist and a non-Calvinist would be, I, as a non-Calvinist, in my approaching God, if that were me in the situation, would say, God, I do not understand why you allowed this. You allowed this person to make these choices. You didn't want him to make this. This is not something that pleases you at all, but you allowed this to happen. I don't understand it, but I trust you. I think a Calvinist, at least if you're following in line with like John Piper and Calvin and R.C. Sproul and others, you would have to pray more like this. It would be, God, I don't know why you unchangeably caused this to happen. Like you actually were the originator of this evil occurrence happening. It happened precisely because it was your specific determination. These are words that the prominent Calvinists will use. And so that again would be where I would just say, like, I can fully get behind the idea of God is in full control in allowing it. And yes, there's still responsibility there. And I would fully acknowledge there's a problem even in my position. Why would he allow that? That doesn't seem right. And I'm not saying I have the full answers to that, but I think beginning to provide an explanation for why God would allow something, explanations that would still be in line with the biblical definitions of love and goodness that we see given in scriptures, would be different than saying, God decisively caused this horrific event. Not only, caused he caused the person not only to do the action of the killing, but he caused this person to be born with such a nature that he could only desire to do evil things, and basically withheld from this person, even the murderer, an ability to repent, to believe. God basically never even offered that as an option to the murderer. And so I would say that it would seem too that even in this system, both the murderer and the victim, I would say, seem to be in some very real sense both victims of God's unchangeable decree. And so that was a lot. And so I'm just going to let you maybe respond and share whatever thoughts you would have to the vantage point that I would be coming from here.
Okay. Every person I know, Calvinist, non-Calvinist, whoever, would pray like you pray. Okay? That's the appropriate prayer. That the appropriate prayer is to say to God, I do not understand, but I still trust you. That's it. Right? I think what Calvin and Piper and these guys, we keep dropping those names. There's others, obviously. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to see it from God's view of eternity. That God not just allowed it, but obviously he is to some degree in control of it and could have prevented it. If he could have prevented it, it's more than just allowing. It's really an ordained event that God has said, because he's completely outside of time. We're getting into philosophy here too, but because he's outside of time, how else could it be? He could stop anything at any moment he ever wanted to, but he decides to not do that. So, can I read a quote actually?
Yeah, absolutely.
You've probably heard the quote from the Westminster Confession. I've heard many people quote that talking about this very issue, right?
Right.
The Belgic Confession, which is actually the Westminster Confession in the Dutch Reformed churches, it's the same idea, but it's written a little bit differently. So I'll just kind of stop where I think it's appropriate. So we believe that the same God, after he had created all things, did not forsake them, nor give them up to fortune or to chance, but that he rules and governs according to his holy will, so that nothing happens in the world without his appointment. Nevertheless, God neither is the author of, nor can he ever be charged with the sins that are committed. For his power and goodness are so great and incomprehensible that he orders and executes his work in the most excellent and just manner, even when devils and wicked men act unjustly. I just thought that's just a great summary of how we should think of this. He's never the author. He never ordains, like he ordains it, but he never commits the act. And I think there's multiple examples in the Bible of that. Just, the book of Job obviously is the most stark example. I've studied Job a fair bit, actually. And I think it's interesting when you see when Job is talking, or when Satan is talking to God, and God says, you can do anything you want, you just cannot kill Job. And my question in my mind came up, why did Satan even obey God in that? Like, why did Satan have to obey God to not kill Job? So obviously God is to some degree able to control Satan to limit his effectiveness, to limit what he can do. So yeah, just a lot of, these are all hard questions, right? So.
Right. Okay. So let me just get to, I mentioned the John Calvin quote, and this
Sure.
will kind of maybe even help us see, areas where maybe John Calvin would not have lined up with some of these confessions.
Well, he's a fallible human being, just like you and I. So
right, exactly, yes.
I don't agree with everything he said. I think there's some things that he said where I have read very little of his, to be honest, very little. So I have a few quotes from him, but I've read very little of John Calvin.
Yeah.
So
and again, the purpose of this, and we'll try to move on here in a minute so we can actually discuss a specific passage again,
Sure.
starting with Ephesians
Sure.
1, because I think it'll be interesting to kind of
Sure.
engage each other's views with that. But just again, to try to get, I'm trying to get a clear understanding of what exactly, where exactly you're coming from. And so maybe this quote might help in and seeing again, this will be, I'll read it and we can both say, do we agree? What are the problems we see with this quote? So John Calvin, and this is a quote from the eternal predestination of God. This is one, obviously, I'm sure this is a quote that many people will be familiar with because it's probably one that's thrown around by non-Calvinists a lot. I acknowledge that, but I do think there's some things in here that are clarifying. So
sure.
He says, how foolish and frail is the support of divine justice afforded by the suggestion that evils come to be not by his will, but by his permission. It is a quite frivolous refuge to say that God odiously permits them when Scripture shows him not only willing, but the author of them. So he's making this distinction between God willing something to happen and God permitting something to happen. So here he said, Scripture shows, according to Calvin, Scripture show that God is, he's not only willing or permissive of the evil things that come to happen, but he is in fact the author of them. And he says, who does not tremble at these judgments with which God works in the hearts of even the wicked, whatever he will, rewarding them nonetheless according to desert. Again, it is quite clear from the evidence of Scripture that God works in the hearts of men to incline their wills just as he will, whether to good for his mercy's sake or to evil according to their merits. And so I think that what I'm hearing from you, I do not hear you, David, being able to line up at least wholeheartedly with the things being said here. But I think that when you talk about how there's a mystery, and you think the John Pipers and Calvins in these situations are trying to get into explaining God's sovereignty and getting into things that maybe are just too lofty for us to understand. And very much of what you're saying there, I would agree with you. And my problem with this is that I don't think you can just say, well, he's saying he's just basically, that's another way of him saying, God allows things and we just don't understand how evil happens. I think this is an example of John Calvin, and what I think John Piper does the same thing, is they don't leave God's sovereignty up to a whole lot of mystery on many cases. They go into giving a clear sort of explanation of how it actually works. And what that means is that God not only permits the evil to happen, he's actually, according to John Calvin here, he's moving the wills of men to do evil. So you have James saying God doesn't even tempt a person to do evil. And you have Calvin saying, no, God actually even implants or moves a person's will toward the temptation in the first place for it to even be appealing to him. And so I would just say this is where these are the things that talking to you, I would probably have a very little issues with the version of Calvinism you're even would hold to and promote. But it's this sort of version of Calvinism that I think I just don't see any other way around it, concluding God as he will say, he's the author. God's not just somebody who's working evil things for good. God's somebody who is puppeting and programming the evil into reality, programming and causing even men to have the exact sinful desires that they have. And then the mystery that Calvin is affording isn't these specific, examples of how God does it. What the mystery he's affording is that we just simply don't know how God is still good in light of the fact that he both causes men to do evil and then he condemns them for the very evil he caused them to do. That's the mystery. Calvin says, there's the mystery. We don't know how that works. I'm saying, I think he's many steps removed from where the mystery actually exists. And the mystery is in how God allows the evil. I just think to go to that point of saying God is the one moving the wills of men to do evil is just that, again, that's where I'd have the issue. And from the sound of what you're saying, you probably wouldn't align with that, but share your kind of thoughts about that quote.
Yeah, so just a couple of things pop in my head. So I've never heard that taught. I've never heard that taught anywhere in any church I've ever gone to. To be that bold, to make that bold a statement. I think I hesitate to say this as well, but it's an honest statement. There are Calvinist churches I wouldn't go to. I think they're too strong on certain issues. I think I think there's a love of God in the world that we need to embrace, that we need to talk about. I think that is the primary thing that we need to be focusing on. I've got a few quotes I'll read you from a second, not just from Calvin, but I think that's what church's role in the world is to bring the love of Christ to the world. Not to teach the world how no matter what they do, it doesn't matter because they're determined already. You know, that whole idea of determinism, it's a funny thing, right? I do believe in election as far as the Calvinist view of election, but that doesn't negate the idea that people are free to choose, because the gospel message is that every man has the ability to choose. And that is a God-given ability. I think outside of our finite minds, in the infinite nature of God, I don't see any other way that God already knows who will be with him in heaven. So God doesn't have to hope that someone's coming to heaven. God isn't trying to figure out how this is going to work out in the end. I think it's all figured out in eternity from the beginning to eternity past. I think the Bible's pretty clear on that. But that doesn't negate our responsibility in any way. You know, when I hear guys like, you know, like yourself, I've heard you say this, I've read some of your responses to other people. And, you know, if determinism is true, then there's no options. Well, okay, that's a true statement to a degree, but God has created us as free creatures. We have the ability to choose right and wrong. We are not forced to do anything. Even though the events that take place are free for us to choose, those are still ordained by God to some degree. He's still allowing those choices. So however degree of control you want to put on that, I think we can agree that that just makes sense. Would I say it as strongly as Calvin did there? I don't think I would. Maybe the way Piper says it, maybe I wouldn't say it that way either. Listen, we have the ability to choose. You know, you do. You really do. And I think I'll share a couple quotes. I think Calvin taught that too. And here's what else I thought of, Jordan. When you read that quote, I often wonder, what was the context of that quote? Who was he trying to push back on? Like, how, during the time of the Reformation, you know, it was such a hard time for these guys to try to regain the truth of the Bible. And maybe they pushed back further than they should have to make a point. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? It's possible. Right?
Yeah. And I think the thing with that is there are, you know, I think that's not the only place where you will see Calvin making such dogmatic and clear statements, you know. And I think that, yes, maybe we could just chalk it more up to a contextual thing, and it was sort of the specific thing that he was just kind of overstated the points he was trying to make. It's just, I think it's the fact that this shows up, you know, multiple times in his writings. And I'm not claiming I've read them all. I haven't read all of Calvin, very little. So that's on me. But I just think that it would be hard. I guess here's what I'd say. If I bring up these quotes and it can be demonstrated that the context shows that Calvin didn't really think that God orchestrates or specifically causes the evil desires of men, you know, I'd be open to hearing that and saying, hey, listen, I've been sharing this quote. I got it wrong. I did not read the entire book or section that this came from. And it's obvious Calvin didn't actually mean that God controls the evil wills of men. If that could be shown to me, I would just make a public apology and say, hey, guys, I shouldn't have shared that quote. I got it wrong. But I would just say that's our next video. Yeah, I'll leave that to the Calvinists to demonstrate that and to show that, you know, there's other quotes where he says the same thing. And if you think the context says something else than what I'm presenting in these videos, then I would say that I would let others demonstrate that. So anyways, you can continue on. I think you were maybe going to share some quotes there before I kind of cut you off.
Sure. So I'll just pick a couple, and you know, and I've made a couple of comments online, and then I said, this is what Calvin believes, and then people push back. Well, he can't believe that because he also said this. Well, okay, you know, are you looking at Calvin's quotes from a finite temporal view, or are you trying to understand the God's view of his whole creation? I think that's where maybe the difference comes in. I don't know if that's clear to people or not, but okay. So John Calvin. So faith is here. This is good. You're going to like this one. Faith is like an empty, open hand stretched out towards God with nothing to offer and everything to receive.
Ooh, that's good.
That's John Calvin.
That's good. I like that. Okay,
like
that's good.
That's what I heard growing up. That's what our faith is, right?
Okay, can you read that once more?
Yeah,
Dave.
So faith is like an empty, open hand stretched out towards God with nothing to offer and everything to receive.
I like that. I'm going to use that. That's a great definition of faith.
How beautiful is that?
Yeah.
Right? And that's how I feel. That's how I feel. It's like, God, let me just do your will. Help me to honor you by serving you in a way that is loving to others, that is promoting the gospel in the world. Help me to be a witness in the world for you. That's my prayer every day. So, all right, a couple more. We will never be clothed in the righteousness of Christ except we first know assuredly that we have no righteousness of ourselves. That's a good one too. Mm-hmm. Humility is the beginning of true intelligence. I gave up all for Christ, and what have I found? I have found everything in Christ. This is all John Calvin. He's a pretty good guy, I think. So, yeah, maybe he said a few things that are a little bit too deterministic, but
right. Yeah. Do you have another one?
Yeah, one more. Men will never worship God with a sincere heart or be roused to fear and obey him with sufficient zeal until they properly understand how much they are indebted to his mercy.
Yeah, those are good.
I love it. That's what I grew up. That's what I grew up hearing. When I hear the determinism stuff, I'm confused because I'm thinking that's not what Calvinism is teaching. We don't teach that no matter what you do, it doesn't matter. I never heard that. Never heard that growing up. So
let me just respond again and say that's not. I would say that's not what all Calvinists are teaching, or that's not what all Calvinists are familiar with or have been exposed to.
You're gonna have to get John Piper on your show and talk to him about it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I do pick on John Piper a lot, but I think the reason for that is because he's kind of one of the at least top dogs in Christianity. If you go do a Google search of did God choose such and such, or what's God's sovereignty look like, you're going to get a lot of John Piper, Ask Pastor John. And so I just think it's somewhat appropriate since he does have such a loud voice. And I think he is saying things, Dave, I would say quite confidently, he would disagree with you, I think, on many points.
Maybe. I don't know.
Which is good. That's kind of what I was hoping to get to in this, what was supposed to be sort of just an initial part of this conversation of just understanding what, where you would align, and it, we could keep talking about this and getting into more of the nuances of what you think about all these things. But I think it'd probably be good to move on at this point, because I think what I'm getting is again that I think the form of God's sovereignty, at least, not that we would fully agree, but I think you at least leave a lot more room in your vocabulary for words like allow or permit, rather than what often, John Piper and Calvin will say, like decisively cause or unchangeably ordain, things like that are more just very specific, where I think it's getting more into trying to put specific limits and definitions on exactly and precisely how God's sovereignty actually works. I think they go too far into trying to really map that out. And I think that's where maybe a lot of the problem comes into, as you're somewhat, I think, suggesting. So anyways, that maybe before, I think this will kind of lead to. Let me make one
comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you have to realize, Jordan, there's some pretty tough texts in the Bible that address this pretty clearly, that God is in control of good and evil, right? Mm-hmm. So, I know there's some Old Testament texts. Of course, there's a few in the New Testament too. I didn't write any of those down, but there's a few. We can
get to some of those as well. Yeah, that would be fun to look at some of those maybe.
Sure. So I know we're approaching an hour long. I don't know how long you want to go, but I got time, so it's up to you. Depends how long you want.
I got time. So yes, there's definitely very strong texts that speak about, I form the light and create darkness and so on, in Isaiah. And, so though maybe we could, not yet, but maybe down here, toward the end of the video, we could look at some of those more, kind of as if it's saying he has this exhaustive, he has this exhaustive sovereignty over all things. And so first, that quote, and I think this could lead into Ephesians 1, because that's where I would like to go. Okay. So the quote that you gave, which I love, again, he says, faith is like an empty, open hand stretched out towards God with nothing to offer and everything to receive. So here's my problem, Dave, with that. And I'm not going to talk about Calvin, although I think I would agree with the people that might push back and say, well, he can't say that here because of the things he says elsewhere. But let's not go there. What I want to know is, okay, when we get to the T of tulip, which you've kind of said that you don't think that's the most beneficial way of dealing with this, but there is a T, there is a total depravity. Yeah. And in Calvinism, and I'm not going to assume this is your version, but that's what I'd like to find out here. In Calvinism, that quote from Calvin, faith is like an empty, open hand. Basically, Calvin is saying faith is nothing. There's nothing in faith itself that has any intrinsic value or merit or worth, as if somebody has faith, now God owes them something. Exactly. So one of the biggest confusions I have with Calvinists is that when I say a person has the ability to believe, without what John Piper will say, he'll say that if somebody says that they can believe without basically God decisively causing them to exert or express that sort of, power, that initial power to be saved, he said, if somebody believes that somebody can have faith, then they don't understand, the full extent of man's depravity, something to that extent. And so my confusion here is, how can, on the one hand, Calvinism hold this idea of faith, that faith is nothing, it's not worth anything, it has no intrinsic value. But then they say, but if somebody chooses to have faith, they are earning their salvation, or they're saving themselves, they're meriting salvation. That's where it's just, I don't understand that, because it feels like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth when they say that. So could you kind of explain where do you land there, and how would you kind of solve what seems to me to be somewhat of a contradiction? Yeah, so that's kind of the conversation we had the other day. I don't remember if it was comments in your website or not, or on your channel, but that we were not able to understand that, because you were saying that Calvinists claim that faith is a work. And that's one of those things that I heard Mike Winger talk about, and I think it was with James White. And I'm listening to both sides, and I'm listening to the arguments, and I'm thinking, no, that's not what he's saying. So I think Ephesians 2 is probably the clear passage that talks about that. So Ephesians 2 verse 8, for by grace you have been saved through faith, right? So through our faith, we're saved. We're in Christ through our faith, right? Mm-hmm. And this is not of your own doing; it is a gift of God. So I think the view on that is that it's the classic: who moved first, God or us, right? Did we move towards God and then He responded, or is God moving towards us and giving us the ability to respond? That's what I believe. I believe we are given the ability to respond, because even our faith is a gift. And I think that's as simple as it gets. Like, faith is not a work. Calvinists don't believe faith is a work, but we believe that if you're responding first, then you're doing something in response to something God is commanding you to do. But we believe that the faith itself is a gift, so, which is part of our salvation, right? So So there's a lot in that. I think I hear what you're saying. So it's basically this idea that faith itself is not righteousness, right? Would you agree with that? Faith isn't itself righteousness. Faith isn't itself a fulfillment of the righteous requirements of the law. Would you agree with that? That's right. Okay. So it doesn't have any meritorious value. But if we choose, if that's even the right word to use, if we have faith, without God first being at the forefront, causing that faith to happen, then us having that faith becomes, what would you say there? Becomes a good work, becomes like earning salvation. How would you word it?
Well, I just think that if God's not the one moving our hearts first, he's not the one who first causes us to even recognize the fact that we need him, then I think our faith becomes something that we do to earn merit. And I think that's a mistake, right? If we're in heaven and we say, we're here because of what we did, I think, Alistair Begg is very clear on that. He's got a couple of fantastic sermons on this. But if ever you're, if ever you say I'm saved because of I believed or because I did this, that's the wrong way to look at it, right? So I have faith. I have faith because of what he did in me. I don't see any other way to see that, to be honest. So
there's so much there that will take so much time probably to unpack. What I think there's some, I would see from my vantage point, some misunderstandings, one, but let me just go to kind of the main thing. Your thing, Calvinism's thing is God has to be the one to make the first move. And if you say man makes the first move, that's a problem. So here's how I would respond to that. I'm pretty confused about where the assumption comes from that, it's that man has been in any sense like left to themselves. I think the gospel and Romans 1, creation itself, where Paul will go on later to say that the heavens declare the glory of God, quoting Psalm 19, basically saying creation itself in some sense is proclaiming the gospel. It's proclaiming the good news of a good God who loves. And he'll say in Romans, nobody has an excuse. And the only ones who, the ones who are experience the wrath of God are those who willfully suppress that truth that is in their face. Then you have Paul in Acts saying that, God's desire, he's basically set this up. He's determined our every person's time that they will live and their location where they will live in such a way that they will reach out to him and grasp for him. And he says, because he's not far from any of us, because it's in him that we live and move and have our being. And then, lastly, just simple verses like John 3:16, for God so loved the world, and we love 1 John because he first loved us. So the idea that what the Bible presents is this idea that God is kind of sitting off to the side with all of humanity, not he hasn't moved toward everybody, but he selects a few people to make a move toward, and those are the ones who have the ability to believe. What I see with all these passages and many more that I could talk about, but the ones I'm talking about here is this idea that the good news, the thing that makes Christianity unique, it's this idea that God has made the first move toward the world. God has taken the first step, and he has given this ability to believe. It's not as if we just are, one day an unregenerate, dead in sin person is like, hey, you know what? I think I'll believe in God today because I just feel like, exerting my own strength and energy to bring myself out of death to life. It's not like that at all. It's that there is conviction. There is light being given. There is the conscience, the testimony of our own, the law written on our hearts. That is, I think, working in every person. And not exactly in the same way in the same time, but God is working. Jesus says, I only do what I see my Father do. My Father is always working. And I just think the fundamental disagreement between myself and the Calvinists would be that God hasn't already made the first move toward everybody. And in doing so has provided the means, the ability to believe as a response. And so when I say that, people believe not apart from God, just basically decisively causing them to believe. I'm not saying that they're doing that independent from God's first movement toward them. I think God makes the first move. Faith is a response, as I think you've already indicated. Faith is a response to something God has already done. We love because he first loved us.
Yeah. So I agree with all of what you just said, actually. As a Calvinist, I think most Calvinists could say that too. We talk about general revelation. I think the whole world can obviously see that there is a God. And I think even most people, I've watched a lot of Ray Comfort videos. I'm sure you know who that is. Ray Comfort, when he approaches people, most people, like literally 90% or whatever, will say they do believe there's a creator for the most part. And that's part of the general revelation. Are we able to choose God without God moving our hearts to actually trust in him, to actually say, I believe you died for my sins. I believe I'm guilty. The thief on the cross is a perfect example of how we are to be in Christ. Is we're supposed to understand that we are guilty, understand what we deserve, understand that Christ didn't deserve what he got, and then plead for mercy. Mm-hmm. That's how we come to Christ. And that message goes out to the whole world. Whether or not people accept that or not is part of God moving in someone's heart to soften that heart so that they will accept it. Like I have a friend of mine, I don't want to talk too much about people personally, but I have a motorcycle. I go on motorcycle trips occasionally, and we've spent some time together. And I've read through chapters of Ephesians and through Romans and tried to explain this to him. And he keeps telling me, Dave, I'm fine. I do good things. I'm fine. Like God loves me. I'm fine. And it's like, no, you have to condemn yourself. You have to be humble, and you have to realize that you are unable. He's got it exactly backwards. So I agree with everything you said, Jordan. I think the revelation, the general call that goes to the whole world is clear, which is why men don't have any reason or any excuse, right? They're all responsible. But I do believe, like when you mentioned total depravity, this is kind of touching on that. Total depravity is not that men are unable to do good things. That's not what that means. What it means is that we are unable to satisfy God's wrath through our righteousness. That's what total depravity is getting at, right? So no matter what we do, we cannot be righteous apart from Christ. So total depravity means we are depraved no matter how much we do to try to satisfy God's wrath. And that's where I think most people don't understand the Calvinist view of total depravity. There's lots of people that do good things in the world. They're just not good things that are earning you anything. You're not earning anything with God. There's no salvation in that. So, right?
So I think, we'd have to talk more about the nuances of it. But just initially hearing that definition of total depravity, I could at least to some extent get behind and word it as like, we are incapable of fulfilling the righteous requirements of the law. We can't, man is going to miss the mark. We can't not miss the mark unless we have, the Spirit of God helping us. And I think it involves like separation. But the definition you just gave, from any Calvinist I've ever heard would be much different. And so I think the total depravity that I hear communicated from the bulk of Calvinists would look like, as an example, talking here about faith, that the non-elect, yes, there's this general revelation, if you want to call it that. There's the witness of of creation. There's the witness of the conscience and the law written on our hearts. All that's there, but ultimately, total depravity to the Calvinism as it is commonly understood would mean that, and even in light of all of this light, that God gives, the non-elect can't actually believe. It's not enough to actually enable them to go that pass from unbelief to belief. Yes, there's a general revelation there, but ultimately, some Calvinists will say the purpose of that is just to bring further condemnation on them, which I don't don't even understand that. It's enough to bring further condemnation on them, but it's not enough to actually enable them to believe. And so would you agree with that, or would you again have maybe some nuances in how you understand it?
I have to apologize. I was trying to find something. I wasn't exactly listening to every word you said.
Nope. You're good.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. I get it. So basically my question is, total depravity as commonly understood in Calvinism today would say that, all the non-elect, we're talking about this general revelation everybody has, that God has given everybody this ability to believe, seems to be what we're saying.
Yeah.
Total depravity as understood by Calvinism, the common version of it anyways, would say that, yes, there is all this general revelation given, but it's not enough to actually enable the non-elect to believe. The non-elect can't, it's different than the regenerating power that God gives somebody to actually believe. Yes, they have all this, the witness of the conscience, the law written on our hearts, the testimony of creation. They have the gospel even proclaimed, and all the other ways that God gives light to every person.
Okay.
But the Calvinists would say that's still not enough to actually enable them to believe. All that really accomplishes is to further their condemnation, because their nature is going to do nothing but, it can't do anything but still reject that light. So does that make sense? Would you agree with that?
Well, I had too many thoughts going on at the same time to respond, but sorry. So yes and no, because I still believe, going back to God needs to act first. And then when we talk about the elect, you have to realize the message of the gospel does not include us even addressing that issue, because the message of the gospel goes to the world. Everyone has the ability to choose, okay? Mm-hmm. The elect and the non-elect, but those who choose will be elect. So in hindsight, God is working out his plan. But in our view, we have no idea what that plan is. So when we talk about the elect, we're not trying to pick and choose who's going to be saved. That's not our job. I have no idea. I have no idea. Like, I talk to everybody, right? Like, I am not afraid to witness. I don't go out in the street, but when I'm at work, when I'm talking to people, they know what I believe. 2 neighbors at my cottage, they both are suffering from throat cancer, and I talked to both of them this week. They know exactly where I stand. So their ability to choose is still real. They do have that real ability to choose. We don't say they don't. And I have no idea if they'll be saved.
Some say they do, but...
Well, maybe. I'm going to read a definition of total depravity right from this book. Watch.
Who's the author of that one?
David Steele and Curtis Thomas. So this is short. So total depravity. When Calvinists speak of man as being totally depraved, they mean that man's nature is corrupt, perverse, and sinful. The adjective total does not mean that each sinner is totally or completely corrupt in his actions or thoughts. Instead, the word total is to indicate that the whole of man's being has been affected by sin. That's it. That's where our whole life has been affected by sin. Nature's been affected. We've been affected. That's why I said to you earlier, John Calvin is a sinful human being. I can't assume that everything he said is correct, right? If John Calvin were alive today, he'd have a podcast just like you.
So I would say again, like the Ligonier ministries, the Desiring Gods, the John MacArthur's, even I would think, the James White's, the Apology. I mean, the Calvinists, at least that I'm familiar with, and the Gospel Coalition, they would say though that the non-elect, we don't know. Yes, agreed. We don't know who the non-elect are, but they would say, if we could know who the non-elect are, we would know for certain that, hey, they've never had an actual ability to believe. God never gave them. Yes, he gave them something. He gave them some measure of light and revelation, but what he gave them wasn't enough to actually believe, because they were not his elect. The only ones he actually gives, this is what, people like R.C. Sproul, Ligonier ministers will say, this is the regeneration precedes faith. This is like the foundational, really, they'll say, idea. If you get this, they'll say, basically you understand Calvinism. So it's this idea that God has to do something very specific in a person, give them life to make them even able to believe.
Yes, I
and
agree
so
with that.
the ultimate implications of that would say that, therefore, then God does not, he selects who to give that to, and not every person in the world can believe. God withholds the ability from some to he withholds that regenerating life. So some just can't ever believe.
So Jordan, what you've just done is that you've taken a eternal view of what we don't see as finite beings. Okay? So in God's plan, he has chosen to elect some. Okay? But I have no idea who that is. I have 3 children. They're not all following God. I am able to say to myself, I am partially responsible for that by not being exactly the father that I should have been. I can also say that their influences in the world have caused them to drift away. But what is my hope? My hope is that God will move their heart. Right? When I pray, that's what I pray for. Mm-hmm. And I think as a Calvinist, what other thing can we do other than pray that God will move in their heart? And I think you would pray the same way, right? Like you would pray that God would move their heart. So if you don't believe that, then how are they going to come to faith other than God decreeing eternally, they're one of my elect and I'm bringing them to myself. They are chosen. They are the one who I will bring to myself. But I don't have that view from eternity, neither do you. So what responsibility do I have? My responsibility is to keep praying, keep trusting, keep being faithful, and preach that God is love and he is kind and he is merciful. And if we humble ourselves, he always accepts us. Always.
Yeah.
No question.
Right. And I grant that there's definitely mystery here, but I think, again, the pushback I would have is that whatever mystery Calvinism affords, there's no mystery relating to the things I'm saying. I think, the RC, again, I'm keep mentioning these Calvinists, but the Calvinists that I've already mentioned, I think they would fully get in line with this idea, just saying it very clearly. Again, there's mystery, but there's not mystery in what I'm saying. This is something I think Calvinism would just, in their systematic, would just spell out, like unapologetically, that yes, within Calvinism, the fact that God has elected some means that he has chosen not to elect others, to pass them over. Some will say he's elected, it's double predestination. But so I guess the question I'm trying to I want to understand, because it seems a little bit like you're saying both. And I don't think that just simply saying there's mystery here works, because, again, I think Calvinism paints a very clear picture. So when it does come to the non-elect, even though we don't know who they are, do you think, in your view, though, that when all is said and done, we'll be able to look back and see that, oh yeah, the non-elect people, that was maybe, Bob and Tom and Phil, who they were never chosen by God. Is it true or untrue that they never had an actual ability to believe, that God never actually gave them the ability to believe? And Calvinism, I think, would say, well, they would have they'd be unapologetic in saying, yeah, the non-elect never were given the grace, the regenerating power to actually have faith. And so I guess where would you stand on that particular issue? Okay.
So I just want to be careful how I word this, because I don't want to make people think that I'm disagreeing with what I think election means. So from God's view, is there any mystery about who's going to be saved? No. God knows. From my view, there's a lot of mystery. I don't know. So election is a view from God. election is God's eternal plan. And I think when we teach it, you know, the immediate response, and I know people who have pushed back on this. I personally know people. So, you know, how can God choose? How can God be so unloving and not give everyone the equal opportunity? I don't know. There's no answer in this world other than to say, I need to be as faithful as I can and trust him as much as I can and be a witness in this world so that everyone who is elect, I mean, there's even instances where Paul says that, like, you know, I'm going back there. I'm trying to remember the text now, but, you know, I have more, there's still a remnant, or there's still people there who I will save. So he has to go back, right? God's not saving everyone. You could then argue and say, well, not everyone has equal opportunity. I guess that's true. From God's view, that's probably what it is. But from my view, how do I even understand that? I can't. And in eternity, God's going to get glory for his loving kindness and mercy, but also for the fact that he has wrath against sin and evil. That also is going to give him the glory that he deserves, because he gets glory in both. But it is not up to me to decide who gets that and who doesn't. I have no idea who that is. I don't know how else to really say it. I have another quote from another Calvinist that clearly teaches this. Like, you know, I think everybody has a real ability to choose from our view. So this has been probably the biggest stumbling block that I've heard usually is from yourself and from others who are saying, well, that's not fair. How can it be? How can God not let somebody else have that ability? I don't know.
Yeah,
I got 42 pages of notes. I don't know if I could find it.
That's okay. While you're looking, I'll just say, like, I think that's an honest answer, and I'm like, I think that's when it comes down to it for the Calvinist, what I would hope, and I'm appreciative of Calvinists like you, although you don't, obviously your version looks different. Most Calvinists will claim that, hey, mine doesn't look like this guy's or that guy's, and so there's quite a variety, but you know, a lot of times when I even present this idea that, hey, it seems, at least on the surface, aspects of how God works in Calvinism, they seem to be unloving and contradict the love of God that is clearly defined in places like 1 Corinthians 13. And so I think the response that is very unfortunate for many Calvinists is just an immediate, like, accusation of, it's basically gaslighting. It's like it suggests in the response that there's something wrong with me or others that we would even ask the question. It's about, you're trying to define love on your own terms. You're trying to make God in your own image, kind of more derogatory things, or you know, basically you just can't accept the cold hard facts of the Bible, basically insinuating that the question itself isn't a legitimate one, which I think is a bit of delusional, you know, self or just denial, because I think at the very least, Calvinists should admit that on the surface, the things that God does justify somebody saying, you know, how does that work? How can God, for instance, this very thing we're talking about, because what you seem to be agreeing with is this idea that the non-elect are never really, God doesn't give them an ability to believe. But then you have verses like 2 Thessalonians, where it will say that the wicked, God basically lets there be a delusion to those who don't receive the truth. And he says he will use for those perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. So he's going to send this deception to certain people because they refuse to love the truth. Yeah. And so you have the Bible saying, like, Jesus will say, you know, you refuse to come to me so that you may have life. And it's like God sort of complaining or getting angry at people who don't respond to the light he's given and believe. And I think there's the contradiction is what I would call it in Calvinism, is that how can you have on the one hand God just holding behind his back with one hand outstretched saying, all day long I've been holding out my hand, just come and take the key to salvation, you know, just believe and repent. All the while, he's got like the power of repentance and faith hidden behind his back. And so it feels to me like a massive charade. Like God's playing this game. On the front end, he's saying, why won't you believe? And he's saying, I'm weeping over Jerusalem. All the while, he's got the very thing he's complaining about hidden behind his back, refusing to just give it to them, knowing that they can't do the thing that he's complaining about. Yeah. And so this is an area where I understand what you've done, and what I think the only thing a Calvinist really can do who's consistent would be to appeal to mystery and say, this is just beyond our understanding. We just can't understand why God works that way. Yeah. If Calvinism was biblical, I'd say, that's just what we have to do. I would just say that I don't think the Bible affords that kind of mystery, because I think when we see that sort of behavior, I think just objectively, that doesn't look like love as we think of it. And so just a quick example, this is something that's been big on my mind lately. Matthew 5, Jesus talking about to his disciples, saying, teaching them to love their enemies. Something very specific he says, love your enemies so that you may be, do good to those who mistreat you, pray for those who spitefully use and abuse you, and so on. And he'll say, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. And then at the very end of that little section there, he'll say, therefore, you must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. So basically, Jesus is commanding his disciples saying, look, you need to love your enemies perfectly, or I would say precisely, exactly as your Father in heaven loves his enemies. So this is one reason why I'd say I don't think the Bible affords this mystery, because here we're being told that we both know and have the ability to love in the exact fashion as our Father in heaven loves his enemies. If Calvinism is true, and we simply have to say, look, God does things that do not seem loving, they do not line up with all the other places where we see love defined, we just have to say that's a mystery. We obviously just don't understand what God's love actually looks like and how it actually operates. Well, now we're rendered completely incapable of fulfilling that command of Jesus to love perfectly as Father loved. Because if God's love looks like Calvinism, love is supposed to be something where we're looking out for the well-being of the other. We do our neighbor no harm. In Calvinism, God is not ultimately seeking the ultimate good of the non-elect. He's not those particular enemies. He's not after their best interests. He's after getting glory from their ultimate demise. And so if love can look like that, basically selecting certain enemies we will show love to, because that's what our Father does. But to love perfectly as our Father loves certainly cannot look like loving all of our enemies, every single individual enemy. And I think at this point, the Calvinists might appeal to mystery and again say, well, we don't know who the non-elect are, so we must love everybody. But I'd say again, the moment you do that, the moment you start loving all of your enemies equally, you are not loving perfectly as our Father in heaven loves. You're not loving your enemies. It doesn't look, God's love for his enemies just doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like showing the same amount of concern and care for every person you come across, particularly, again, in this context, your enemies. What God's love, our Father in heaven's love, looks like, again, is a very selective. He selects certain of his enemies that, yes, he will show grace to, but the others, he will demonstrate a lack of compassion, a lack of mercy and forgiveness to, so that his wrath is clearly demonstrated. And so I think to love perfectly, I'm sorry, this is kind of long-winded and I'm wrapping up here. To love perfectly as our Father in heaven loves must look like, in some fashion, being selective in the enemies that we love. I'm not claiming I would know how that would work or how we would know how to do that. But I think by definition, to fulfill the command of Jesus in Matthew 5, I just don't see, if Calvinism is true, how you could possibly think that loving all of your enemies, showing the same amount of genuine care and love for everybody, I don't see how you could see that as fulfilling, a Calvinist at least, could see that as fulfilling the command of Jesus. Because the command of Jesus seems to imply that we can love exactly, or can and should love perfectly, precisely, exactly as our Father in heaven loves. And in Calvinism, that just simply doesn't look like loving everybody with the same amount of care and concern.
Okay.
So that was sort of a sermon, but give me your thoughts. I'm sorry about that.
Well, like you say, there's a lot there. So, okay.
Yes, I know.
All right. I think that verse perfectly fits with Calvinism. And the reason is, first of all, who is God's enemy? We all are. Right. In our sinful world. In the sinful world, he came to save sinners. We're all sinners. So we are all technically his enemy. So the act of him doing that for us, if we are not reciprocating that same act to the world, so that those who are going to come to him, like that, it would be, I think it would deny our own salvation if we were not to live our lives as Christians, loving others in the world. Okay.
Agreed.
This brings up another interesting point, which I don't want to go on a tangent, but I've heard.
I did, so you might as well.
Yeah, whatever. I want to fit so much into 3 minutes, but anyway, I've heard people say, I've listened to a ton of sermons from Arminian point of view, from a point of view that you hold to, which isn't Arminian, I know. What do you call it again? Sorry,
I don't have a name for it, honestly. No, I don't really claim to be a provisionist. I don't.
Okay.
I mean,
okay.
I agree with much of what. It's interesting because a lot of the conclusions I've reached about the different passages I found later on, and so I agree with much of provisionism. For the most part, but I don't use that label.
I actually do too. I think provisionism has a lot of good in it. I just think there are parts of it that need some adjustment, which is why I'm here. So
right.
When we talk about the world, or we talk about all people, I have heard multiple sermons now of Arminians saying all means all, world always means world. It's like, well, it means what it means in the context of what is being said. Okay, so we can't go through all those verses, but when God says love the world, well, that means we are to love everyone in the world the same way. Can we do that? Are we able to do that? I think that's a very, very hard thing. I don't think we can do that. When Jesus was talking about if you lust for a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. Well, that's a pretty tall order that we can't meet that, right? So I think a lot of things that we're told to do are not actually possible for us to do. The only way it's possible for us to do them is through Christ's righteousness, not our own. And I think
so it is possible. No, I think it is.
There was something else I had actually heard from a provisionist point of view, that if total depravity is not true, then technically speaking, a man could live a perfect life. Technically speaking, I just don't think that the Bible teaches that.
You said a provisionist. I'm sorry, I don't think I heard that well. You said a provisionist said that if total depravity is not true, then a person could live.
Then,
perfectly?
well, the question was posed. Okay, so the question was posed: if you don't believe in total depravity, which in other words talks about our sinful nature, which I read the thing before. So if our sinful nature is corrupt, like our nature is corrupt in sin, there's no possibility of us even becoming anything other than sinful. Okay, but in a provisionist view, in a view that sees man as being born neutral, let's say, technically speaking, could a man live a perfect life? Technically speaking, in that view, yes, because man is only sinful when he chooses to sin. But if we believe our nature is sinful, like Jesus said, even if you think a lustful thought, you've committed adultery. How can we even avoid that? It's impossible to even avoid sinning. So I think Jesus' command and what you just mentioned in, where was it again? Matthew 5, I think. You are righteous. I don't know how that verse went now. You read it. But
he says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Okay, but we can't be perfect. So why does he say that? Why does he say that to us? Well, I'm not a Bible theologian. I'd have to study that a little bit and see. But I think some of those things we're told to do and to be are obviously things we cannot do. So the only way we can come to God in righteousness is through Christ's righteousness. And I think that's why we're told these things. The rich young ruler coming to Jesus, that whole story, actually, to promote MacArthur, he has a fantastic sermon on that. If you listen to what he says, like, of course that ruler, he thinks he's self-righteous. He thinks, and even the disciples are saying, righteousness in the Jewish faith was that if you're blessed with, gifts, if you're rich and you're blessed, obviously you're righteous. That's what they thought. And then the disciples asked Jesus, well, if he can't even be righteous, who can be righteous? And then Jesus says, with man, it's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. So I think even that example shows that no matter what we do, we can think what we're doing is giving us some merit or giving us some form of favor in God's eyes. That's a myth. That's, and there's so many religions in the world that believe things like that. Catholicism to a certain degree believes that, right? You do these things and you're okay with God, and that's just not what the Bible teaches. So that exact passage, I'd have to read it and study it, but I think we're told things. I think we're told things to do that we just can't do. And how do we do them? We only do them through Christ. That's the only way we can be righteous, is through him.
Yeah. So I agree that what the things Jesus commands in certain situations are things that I would articulate it in the way of saying we cannot do in and of ourselves or separate from the enabling power of God to fulfill those things. But I think you see Paul like telling the Galatians, saying the fruit of the Spirit is this: it's love, joy, peace, patience. It's all these things. Yeah. The natural outworking of faith in God is that you will be loving perfectly as your Father loves. I think you will be not lusting. It's the power of Him working in you. But I think the point here is that Jesus is saying that yes, separate from Him, separate from His power, He's saying, look, you need another way. I think He's basically saying doing this by self-effort and works is not enough. And as much, it's Romans 7. The more you do that, the more sin is going to be stirred up in you. The more you try to overcome it in your own power. So He's saying, indicating, I think, that we need something else. And I think, again, that's faith. But the point is that I think we can. Jesus expects that, yes, we can't by ourselves, but we can, by the power of the Spirit, fulfill this command to love perfectly. And we don't have to hang out here much longer. I just think that the whole point of what I'm trying to say is that I think the Bible affords a variety of mysteries that, yes, it's okay and legitimate to just say, well, that's something we just don't understand and we don't know. But I think there's certain mysteries that are not afforded, where it becomes somewhat passive to simply appeal to mystery in certain scenarios. And one of those, I would argue, would be this one, when it's dealing with the most, really, arguably one of the most, if not the most important aspect of Christianity is understanding God's love and what it looks like. Because if we don't understand that, what do we know? What can we do? It says in 1 John, this is how we know what love is, that He gave up his son for us and things like that. So again, I don't think it's okay to just say, well, that thing God does is objectively, at least on the surface, an unloving thing. God, everybody deserves wrath, but God has selected some to show His kindness to, so that and show His wrath on the others, not ever giving them the ability, as we've already talked about, not giving them a real ability to believe, and then condemning them for not believing. And so that, objectively, I would argue, is a contradiction that I don't think can legitimately and validly just be dismissed as a mystery that we just don't know. The reason is, again, because I think we have clear definitions of love, not only definitions in 1 Corinthians 13, but we have the perfect example of love walked out in the life of Christ. Okay. And I don't know, again, how my whole point in this, again, we don't, probably best if we don't hang out here much longer, but okay. The whole point in this is that Jesus commanded us to love perfectly as he appeals to the way our Father in heaven loves. Yes. I think this deserves a legitimate response. This is a legitimate, valid question. I'm not expecting you to do this now, but I'm just saying Calvinism, this deserves a legitimate response to say, yeah, that's fine. And I would just say, I don't see that as a mystery that can be afforded, for the reason that we are, if it is a mystery, I'd say the problem with that is that, well, we can't fulfill that command to love perfectly, because we don't know what God's love looks like.
Let me give a quick response, okay?
Okay.
Is justice loving or unloving? Just to answer. Could you answer that?
I think it's loving. True justice is well, I don't know. I don't know how I'd answer that, honestly. I'd want to think about that. I'll appeal to mystery.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, you're in my camp.
Yeah.
So, if your child was abducted and the person who did it was caught and charged and convicted, you would say that judge is just and loving in his conviction, because it is giving justice to something that deserves justice. Because God is the judge, he's the king, he's the ruler, like he's everything. When God gives justice, it is loving, because he is giving justice that was perpetrated, evil was perpetrated against him, okay? So what we have to realize is that in him giving justice, no one is going to be treated unjustly. How he decides that, how I can say I am in Christ is something I just need to give more and more glory to him for, because why he chose me, I don't know. I don't know. Could he have let me go? Listen, I quit life group in our church about 4 or 5 years ago. I was frustrated. This whole thing I was talking about earlier. Why I'm back where I'm at, can I say it was because of what I did? Yeah, I can actually. I could say I started doing this and this and this better. Can I ultimately say it was me? No, I can't. I can't say that I came back the way I did, and my wife, too, she was praying for me every day. So I went through a big struggle. And I can honestly say that I am now where I'm at, which is hopefully continuing, is because I'm in Christ now. So why that decision was made to bring me this far, I don't know. And not my neighbor, not someone else I know, not my friend. So all I can do is continue to have that faith. And, yes, there's mystery here. You can't say that we can understand this. Your objection doesn't really solve the problem, because we know there will be people in hell. Could God save them all? Yes, he could. Why doesn't he? I don't know. One of the pastors I met, I was mentioned to him a few weeks ago, I had met with him, and he said to me, the book of Ephesians, some people are led to believe that because of the book of Ephesians, they become universalists, because they just cannot see God using his wrath against anyone. That danger exists in the book of Ephesians. And I thought, that's interesting. I need to do more time to study that, but that's an interesting point. So someone's going to hell. We know Jesus said that. How we can figure that out. Listen, I don't know.
Side road, but my views of hell are somewhat pending. But I do pretty confidently, this might trouble some people, but it is what it is. I do pretty confidently not affirm the traditional eternal conscious torment view. That's a whole other discussion, but just to have that awareness. But here's where I'd say the distinction comes here, Dave, is that I get what you're saying. I get that there's a mystery, and I'm not claiming that I know every specific reason why you are where you are and somebody else isn't where they are. I'm not going to go and draw a diagram and say, well, it's because you had faith here and you did You were humble here. I don't know. I do think that the Bible does put emphasis over and over again on our responsibility to humble ourselves and have faith. So I do think that, and I think it would be a little bit silly for me to not just assume biblically that, hey, I can say pretty confidently, Dave, based on the scripture, part of the reason you are where you are, if you're following God, is because there's been humility in you. And the important thing would be to make a distinction between you having humility and that being equivalent to you fulfilling the righteous requirements of the law, which is so often a false equation that is made. That if you can realize that, hey, you having humility, that is not equivalent to you fulfilling the righteous requirement of the law. I think there's such a category error here where Calvinists see, oh, well, you're not capable, you're totally depraved. You can't be righteous on your own. If you're humble in any way, you're fulfilling that. Well, people all around the world show humility in various contexts. Husbands and wives, when there's a fight, there's if it's going to be resolved, is going to by necessity, I think, involve a measure of humility. So humility in itself, I think, is just, you have to be out of touch with a person has to be out of touch with reality to think that humility is not something that everybody has the capacity to express. And so I'm going off on a side road here. My point is just to say that, and let me say this, and then I'll let you have the kind of the final word on this particular thing. And then let's maybe try to get to Ephesians if you have the time, because we keep saying we're going to.
Let's do Ephesians another time, if you don't mind. I should.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. So let me just say this, and we can wrap this up. The difference here is that, yes, there's a mystery in all this and how this works. How does God's sovereignty work with our response and our humbling of ourselves? I think that this difference would be, though, in terms of people being in hell, whatever hell, people being judged, people having condemnation, which some will be condemned. I don't claim to know exactly what that means or what that looks like. But the difference is that in Calvinism, those who are condemned because that has been what God specifically ordained for them, unchangeably. So in other words, these people disbelieve and disobey. The Second Thessalonians I just read, they perish, they're condemned, they're given over to false delusions because they refuse to receive a love for the truth. Well, really what Paul's describing there in Calvinism is secondary at best as far as causality, because underlying that in Calvinism is actually they refuse to receive a love for the truth because God refused to grant them the ability to love the truth, because God hated them before they were born, according to Romans 9. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, the way Calvinists often interpret that. God hated them, and so they were born with a nature to hate him back, and now they're going to perish for eternity because God is going to condemn them for doing the very things he caused them to do. This, again, people will just say, hey, he's being emotional. He's making an emotional argument. I would just call back and say, no, I'm not. This argument I'm giving is based upon not emotion, but the revelation of God that is given in Scripture, the definition of love given in 1 Corinthians 13, and the description and command to love perfectly that is given in Matthew 5. And I would just say this is not something, I think, that can be appealed to mystery, because we have to know what love really is, or we can't be Christians, I would say. If love is a mystery, what it is, what it looks like, I don't see how Christianity can function, because at base level, we have to know what love is and what it looks like to love people. And if Calvinism, again, I'll just say, if Calvinism can look, or God's love can look like that, then that's an issue. And so ultimately the difference would be between those who are condemned in hell and Calvinism are condemned in hell because that's precisely what God wanted to happen and unchangeably ordained it to be that way. Even if we just leave it to not determining every sinful desire, as Calvin would say, but just say he willfully, purposefully withheld the ability from these people to ever believe. And then he condemns them for not believing. I'd say that's squaring a circle to me. It's saying this is an just thing, because again, objectively, I would say from the moral law written on our hearts, from the biblical testimony of what goodness should and does look like, that's not good. And so if it is good and we simply have to appeal to mystery, well, now we no longer know what goodness is, because goodness is actually mysterious in terms of what it should look like. We don't know what goodness is, because it can look like something that fundamentally disagrees with everything we know and think about what goodness looks like. No human in any human court, just court law system would bring that sort of condemnation upon a person. If it was found in the scenario you described, I'm sorry, I'm ranting again. I'm finishing up here. Okay. If it was found in the scenario of the murderer or the abductor, the person who abducted the children, like you said probably 5 minutes ago, yes, that would be just if a judge condemned him. Absolutely, I 100% agree with you. What would not be just is if it was discovered later on, as Leighton Flowers kind of gave this analogy, and I think it works. If it was found later on that at night, the night before, a scientist had snuck into this guy's room and secretly implanted like nodes into his brain that would rewire what his desires were and cause him to only desire to abduct children. He couldn't help but only desire that. And he took away through these nodes and the electrical things that were being caused in his brain, caused him to only desire to abduct children. And that desire to not abduct children was completely withheld from him. If that was discovered later on, I guess what I'll ask you as my final end to this spiel would be, would we be able to justly condemn that person as having committed a horrific crime and look at him as a criminal?
Well, I think in your view, the only way to justify that is to say God is not in control of everything. Right? That's the only logical conclusion. Because if
I don't think so, though.
Well,
I would disagree with that. Just to point out, but go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, you're putting me on the spot a little bit. I mean,
I know.
Like I said, we're trying to take an analogy that's a human analogy and attribute it to eternal salvation for all eternity. Like, it's just such a hard thing.
Right.
But I think we have to always remember that justice will always be served. God is kind, loving, and just, merciful, and how he shows his mercy to some, but not to others. How do we answer that question?
Yeah,
I'm just trying to live a faithful life. Like, through this, I hope other people out there will see, the Calvinist view is not what a lot of people seem to think it is. That's one of the objectives I had coming to do this was, I think really there are some misconceptions. They're not all unfounded. I understand that. There's some difficulties with a deterministic view of how people live their life thinking that way, because there's a danger of thinking, well, I'm elect, you're not, too bad for you. Well, the Bible never teaches that, right? And people who think that way, and there is that danger that does exist. I mean, Calvinists can become haughty, they can become arrogant,
extreme, yeah,
right? But a lot of the objections don't just apply to us, right? There are other people I've seen in other types of Christianity that I've also seen evidence of.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. I don't think that's just, I mean.
No way. No, not even close.
Right. On Leighton Flowers, and I really don't want to name names, but I mean, Leighton's one of the main guys, obviously. So He interviewed a pastor. Okay. And this pastor came out of Calvinism. So Calvinism bad, obviously, in his mind. But what he described, what I heard him describing, was that he was angry, he was arrogant, he was prideful, therefore Calvinism's bad. Well, all I can think of is like, well, I've met tons of Calvinists who are not arrogant or proud. They're very humble. And the whole idea of Calvinism is that if you think you're elect for some reason, that's a problem. It should make you as humble as you could possibly be, right? So when I hear someone speak that way and then they blame Calvinism for their sinful actions, that doesn't quite fit with me. So and like I said, I've heard other views from Arminian views. There's a few preachers I heard that were Arminian preachers that were kind of blunt, I guess you could say, that were also, wow, okay, that's pretty strong language, but okay. But anyway, so it's all out there, right? Listen, God is a God of love and mercy, and he will let me read this last quote, and then maybe we just
okay.
So
Yeah.
An early Puritan, his name was John Preston. He said this: "Go and tell everyone without exception that there is good news for him. Christ is dead for him. We preach Christ crucified. Jesus is able to save to the uttermost all that come to him. He promises to save all that will come to him." That's a Calvinist. That's what the Bible teaches. Everyone that comes to me, I will never turn anyone away. And how election works into that, that's not up to me to worry about. If God is working this out somehow, that's all I can do is trust him, right? So
yeah. Well,
Dave, I think it was providential that I met you. Like, I really do believe that. I hope that this conversation will help people. I mentioned that to you in a text. I really hope people will, not decide which camp they're in. I don't really care what camp they're in, to be honest. I want them to rest in Christ. I want them to be stronger in their faith, be good parents, be good husbands and wives, live a life that is honoring to God, and be a witness in the world through those actions. That's what I think people should do. So
yeah. Well, Dave, obviously we fundamentally disagree about some things, but I look at you and I see a brother and a friend.
I used to kind of think, and I'll be honest, I used to kind of think that people's motives were wrong. Alyssa Childers, I watched a video from her about a year and a half ago, and she says we can't judge motives. Like, you have to have the idea that everybody's trying to do the right thing.
Right.
And that kind of hit me, because it's like, yeah, that's true. Why am I thinking that if they don't agree with me, they're trying to do something wrong, right? Like, that's that's so silly.
That's an excellent point, Dave.
Yeah.
That is an excellent point, and that's gets at the definition of love in 1 Corinthians 13. It says
Absolutely.
Love believes all things, hopes all things.
Yeah.
Love, what it looks like, is looking at the person, and your initial action is to think the best of them. You hope that the best of their character until you're proven otherwise.